How good is the R3 and how much do I like it? Today will be a final review of the Canon EOS R3. I'm Richard and welcome to Zappy Productions. I think you have saw the photos that I took with the R3 just now. Those were all photos done when I owned this camera for the last 1.5 months. Now, just to note that when I had this camera shortly after the Z9 came out, so I had, I would say, not as long of a usage that I wanted to be, but I still did about 24 photo shoots with this R3 itself. As you can see just now, those were about 20 photo shoots. And that said, the R3 has gave me quite a good impression. And if you have followed my channel, I do use the other flagships, the A1 and the Z9s. And I can honestly say that among all these three systems, for the purpose of portrait photography, I do prefer this a little more. But this is of course certain reasons and I'll explain in this video here. But that said, without wasting time, let's go through certain topics of the R3. And I have already done initial looks, videos and follow-ups on the R3 itself, and I will link along the way for more in-depth details if you want to take a look at those tests. First, let's talk about body. Now, the R3 is a body with a grip. It's integrated, you can't remove it. And on general, if you have go online and search the weight of it, R3 is actually the lightest body with a grip itself. In fact, the A1 and the R5 do weigh more if you put a grip, about 100 to 150 grams more. And the Z9 weighs about 200 over grams more than the R3. So the weight of the R3 is actually 1 kg or 1015 grams. So it is actually really light for a camera with a grip. Now, the grip do give a little bit of advantage, additional buttons and then new layouts behind, and of course the ability to hold it vertically. Now, there's only one problem with the grip here, and the grip here you can see from the side here, this is curved. In fact, the whole grip is like this, and I don't quite like the curve itself. It's not as stable as the main grip. The main grip, if you actually look from the top, it's actually a deep hole and then you can hold it really, really tightly. But this grip here, not as stable. But other than that, it still works out really well, and in the field, you will prefer the grip rather than holding this for like 90% of your shoot if you are a portrait photographer. Now, that being said, other than the grip, the only thing I didn't like about this camera is this hot shoe cap. And if you actually go online and search some materials, the hot shoe cap is actually an essential item for the purpose of weather sealing. I have lost one, and the replacement cost of this is 18 Sing dollars, or about 12 USD. It's really expensive to replace something that is so easy to drop. In fact, in my previous shoot, like yesterday, I dropped this cap on the floor. Lucky I saw it. If not, I have to pay another $18, which is expensive. Luckily, the new R5C has a new improved cap, but I do not know whether will that affect weather sealing or not. This cap is proven, or at least based on specs, to give the full weather sealing of the R3 here. And talking about weather sealing, the R3 is supposed to be built like the 1DX and have a weather sealing like the 1DX. Now, I'm not a person who abused my camera, so I didn't run it through rain. But if Canon say it's true, this camera should be able to withstand heavy rains and storms as long as you don't soak it forever in those conditions itself. But that said, battery life of this camera is really good. I last for about 5 shoots, so I don't have any issues there. The amount of buttons are also a lot because of the additional grip. So there are buttons from the top and there are also buttons at the side. And there's 4 buttons in front, which I don't use much, honestly. Those were not intuitive to me. I rarely use buttons at the front. That said, in real world usage, I find that there is more than enough buttons for all the key functions I want to use in a portrait shoot or swapping to various key needs. The only thing I had issue with, or should I say, I can't find a very good way, is the toggle the AF controls, or should I say, how the AF actually works. You have to use the menu and click around. Now, I'm not too sure. Maybe I lack certain understanding on some menu items here. But I did set up in such a way that I still do less than 2 clicks to get any setting done on this camera here. Now, that being said, there's only 2 more things I want to talk about when it comes to build quality. The rest you can take a look at the video here. Firstly is that this very angle screen, this is I would say this is the second best design I like. The best design I like is in the GFX 100 and in the Z9, where they can actually flip portrait wise and still maintain the center of the screen without pulling this whole screen out to the side. But that said, if I don't have those screens, this is the second best that I like. And the worst is, of course, the A1 screen, which only can flip on landscape mode, which is totally not very useful for me as a portrait photographer. And this screen, of course, is the best screen if you're doing videos, partially because you can push it out of the way, and because the back here, if you put it on a gimbal, you will get blocked. So sideways is still better than the back if you are doing videos. The screen is very high resolution. I think this is a 3 million dot screen. I think one of the highest resolution in the market for a behind the camera screen. So if you are reviewing photos, it looks really good here. Now the EVF, nothing really special, feels the same as the R5, just that the latency feels lower than the R5, which means it feels more live when you're looking through the viewfinder and the actual subject itself. This may be, of course, due to the stack sensor design, the internals that refreshes the EVF faster. But other than that, I don't find any much difference from most of the high-end EVFs today. That being said, the A1 has the best EVF in terms of sharpness. That's really about it. The second best is probably those in the R5 and the R3 here. Now, one thing I like about the EVF is the eye relief, or the extension out of the back of the body. It is more than a finger. My finger is quite fat, so it's more than a finger. And that is actually really good because your nose and mouth won't be touching the back of the screen and therefore messing around, doing activating touches, or dirtying the screen, which is disgusting. So a good amount of eye relief or extension from the back here, more than 1 finger deep. Other than that, the build quality and the body itself, I don't have much to talk about. It is 1DX equivalent, just a smaller version of the 1DX. I'm very happy with the body, and in the field usage, I find very confident to hold and use this camera. In fact, probably more confident than the rest. Just that some of the menu items are a bit different. Some things I like in the Sony, some things I like in the Canon, but if not, the body and handling of this camera is something I quite like to use in the field. Next, I'll talk about image stabilization, and the R3 is a very stable platform for the purpose of shooting itself. And coupled with the image stabilization and the relatively stable continuous AF system within the body and RF lenses, you can actually shoot at really low shutter speed and still obtain the photos you want. In fact, with RF lenses, I can do 1/5 of a shutter with a 85mm lens and still get 90% sharp photos. I did a test on IBIS before in one of my previous videos. Take a look at that link there. But I redid some more tests, and it kind of confirms that this whole platform here is really stable, and I can use continuous autofocus and maintain those really sharp shots with image stabilization. 1/5 of a shutter for 85mm result in 90% keeper rate, one of the best you can ever get. That is, of course, if you are shooting still subjects. What if you are shooting humans, which tend to jitter and move a little bit? And based on my test with this setup here, this is the 2870 f2. With the R3, I managed to shoot up to 1/15 of a shutter, or should I say as low as 1/15 of a shutter, and still get a really sharp shot as in this photo here. So it is a very impressive performance, and I really like the image stabilization on the R3. Next, we'll talk about image quality. And the R3, straight out of the box, have 24 megapixels. I mean, everybody knows about it, and I think that is quite a sore point, if you ask me, for many people who are looking at high-end cameras. I won't call the R3 flagship because Canon don't call it flagship, and some people below always say in the comments that R3 is not a flagship. Yes, so be it. But that said, 24 megapixels is a little bit disappointing for this range of cameras of $8,000, 8,000 Sing dollars, which is about 6,000 USD. Because the Z9 has 45, while the A1 has 50, and the A7R4 has like 62, and the R5 has like 45. So 24 is a bit disappointing on the R3 itself. But to put things into perspective, 24 is actually a lot of pixels still. If you look at your TV today, a 4K TV has 8 megapixels, and most people can live with a 4K TV at 55 inches or even 65 inches wide. So a 24 megapixel photo will be 3 times the resolution. Definitely more than enough to fill 2.5 TVs, or 3 TVs if you're looking at just pixels itself. So if you're looking at a photo as a whole, the R3 do provide more than enough pixels, and you can even crop a little bit and still be a lot of pixels left. But that said, if you are into extreme cropping like landscape and stuff, the R3 resolution is still 24 megapixels, and if you are looking for details or wanting to print A0 and standing 5 cm from it, the R3 won't give you the resolution. I will just outright say that. But resolution is one thing. There is also the other subject on dynamic range. And I did a previous test with the Z9A1 and the R3. Click on the link here. And in that test itself, I find that the R3, there is a difference between mechanical and electronic. I explained in that video there, and also I explained in the previous video, there is a difference. The electronic shutter has a little bit more noise. However, that said, if you are looking for maximum dynamic range, the mechanical shutter is available, and it has a noise level slightly better than the Z9, which is better than the A1. So if you ask me in terms of dynamic range, if you are looking at mechanical shutter, this sensor here has the best dynamic range for high-end cameras. But if you are looking at electronic shutter, they are all the same. It's just that this one loses a bit of low end, but has better high ends than the Z9. And I also can show you this chart from photons to photo, and you will see that that's pretty much the case. Where you are shooting electronic shutter on the R3, it is the same as the rest, and if you are shooting mechanical shutter on the R3, it is better than the rest when it comes to dynamic range. And when it comes to buffer depth itself, I do like the R3 buffer depth because you can do up to 200 RAWs if you're using CF Express, and about 180 RAWs if you are doing SD card. That's talking about 6 seconds of full 30 frames per second burst. And it clears really quick too. With CF Express, you clear within 6 seconds, and with SD card, you clear within 15 seconds if you're using a V60. I'm assuming that if you're using a V90 card, you probably can clear in 12 or 10 seconds. So the R3 is actually a very pleasant camera to use if you are looking to burst this camera constantly, because the buffer clearing speed and the overall buffer depth is really good. Now, the other two cameras here, the A1 and Z9, have certain conditions to meet if you want to do certain buffer depths, but the R3 is just the most, I would say, is idiot-proof when it comes to bursting and clearing buffer and just shooting non-stop. I mean, this is probably why it was designed this way, and I do say that this design in the R3 is something that I prefer over the other cameras. And lastly, we'll talk about autofocus for photography. Now, autofocus, I'm a portrait photographer from the start, as I said, so I do not actually, go very in-depth into autofocus performance. I mean, as long as it meets my needs, it's good enough. But I did try to shoot something moving faster. So what I did was I shoot some cars on the road, and the R3 with the native lens will almost never miss. I shoot the cars running towards me, running away from me, going through trees. It almost never misses itself. The only time that it was totally unusable was the signboard blocking the car itself. And that means that out of like 250 shots, I only missed like 2 shots because of the signboard blocking it. And then it catches up really quick. Even though it's doing 30 frames per second, the signboard blocks it for 2 frames, and straight away you'll capture onto the car again, the 3rd frame. So the R3 performance when it comes to fast-moving objects like cars, the R3 actually performs very well when it comes to autofocus. Now, when it comes to human autofocus, I got my friend to walk towards me and spin, and I would say as I missed not a single shot with the 85 1.2. It takes only about 2 frames to capture the eyes. If let's say the person spins, the hair blocks the eye. The moment the eye appears in the frame, it takes about 2 frames for the R3 to capture onto the eye, which is very impressive performance and very predictable if you ask me. Now, of course, if it doesn't capture the eye, then IF will just not work, and you just miss all the way and get soft eyes. But so far, the R3 is very reliable when it comes to such a case where you are tracking a person, the person spins, 2 frames, and the eye will be sharp again. Now, I also did using third-party lenses, and third-party lenses for portraiture, no issue, performs very similar to what I said just now. But third-party lenses, when I'm shooting small remote-controlled cars, I got my car to run towards the camera. What happened is that the hit rate in that case will be about 90+%. Not as good as using the native lens shooting fast-moving real cars, but shooting the RC cars did result in a lower hit rate for the Sigma 135mm f1.8 adapted through a EF to RF adapter. Still a very good performance, 90-something%. So overall, if you ask me, the AF on the R3 is very capable of high-speed shooting of subjects running towards you or running away from you or spinning around. Now, that is of course you are talking about such motion, but for me as a portrait photographer, the most important thing is how accurate is the IAF in all distances. Now, I'm not looking at high speed. I'm not going to ask my model to just run around erratically and randomly. So it's mainly about spinning, posing, and going close. And among all the autofocus system, I would say as I like the R3 one the best, and that's because in close range, it never misses the eye. Even if the person is wearing specs, has some hair on the eye, has long lashes, and because of what I shoot, and Asian girls like to put really long lashes, and of course have bangs and stuff, I enjoy the R3 the best because almost any other camera here have a higher tendency to capture hair, lashes, and spectacles that is not the iris itself. Somehow Canon has perfected the iris autofocus. It focuses really nicely on the iris itself in eye detection. And I'm very happy to say that the R3 is slightly better than the R5 in that aspect. Maybe because it's 24 megapixels, but I do really enjoy the eye detection autofocus best on the R3. And lastly, let's talk about video functions on the R3 itself. First, when it comes to video rolling shutter, I would say as a video rolling shutter on the R3, even though it has a lower sync speed, it's the same as the A1. I did notice that, I did a previous video on it, click on the link here, and I did rolling shutter testing with the A1 and R3, looks almost the same. The amount of shearing and distortion feels the same as the A1, which put it at a very good ground. And when it comes to the files themselves, Canon do shoot in many modes, MP4, HEVC, and of course RAW, and you can choose whatever you want to meet your needs. If you are shooting RAW and 120 frames per second, you will have to use a CF Express. If not, everything else you can use SD card. Now, talking about shooting at the different modes, only 120p overheats on the R3. The R3, same as the Sony, has a high heat mode or a high temperature mode, allowing you to use the R3 in prolonged periods even if it's a bit warm. In that mode, almost no other modes actually overheat, including 60p, 6K RAW. It only overheats in 120p. Now, I'm not too sure why it overheats. Maybe it's the file format because you can only use All-I and a 4K, which actually results in a very big file and heats the card up like crazy. So I'm not sure is it because of that. But the Z9 doesn't overheat at all, and the R5C seems to not overheat also. The A1 also lasts longer than the R3. The A1 actually does 120p for like 50 minutes. So if you are looking at 120 frames a second shooting, the R3 is probably the worst performer. But if you are looking at internal RAW, ability to shoot confidently in any other 4K mode, and not only that, it is oversampled in 4K 60p and 4K 30p. So the 4K mode on this camera is actually really sharp and really nice, even in 60p, unlike the A1, which at 60p you actually lose a bit of quality. The Z9 too. So if you are looking at 4K, 60p, 30p, the R3 is probably my preferred choice. And if you are looking at 6K RAW, the R3 is of course my preferred choice too. Now that said, the Sony will be able to shoot 8K RAW externally, while the Z9 will be able to shoot the 8K RAW internally in the future firmware. But for now, at least, I think the R3 video is very good and comprehensive. Now, of course, there is the new R5C, and if you just based on the spec and you fit R5C with power, the R5C will probably be a better video camera than the R3. At least that's what I think. Until I have my camera on hand or have a sample set, probably, I wouldn't know whether the R5C is better than the R3 or not. So that's really about it for video. Now, I only did 2 video shoots with the R3, and those are done shoots. And I don't really need to try the autofocus. I lock down the autofocus. I just shoot in RAW and then post-process. I do find the raw files on the R3 very nice to edit. However, it doesn't play smoothly on a MacBook Pro. Even in DaVinci Resolve, it is very jittery, and you will have to create proxy files to actually deal with it, at least on the MacBook Pro itself. And that's my experience with the 6K RAW 60p on the R3. And overall, how do I feel about the R3? Now, this is my final thoughts, and I would say it is subjective because I'm a portrait photographer and I have certain use case. Among all the flagship cameras that I own today and high-end cameras I own today, I do enjoy using the R3 the best, and there are a few reasons to it. Firstly, I find that the autofocus is very predictable. As long as IAF works, I almost never miss. It doesn't have any tendency to focus on things I don't want it to focus on. So I do really like the autofocus system and performance of the R3. Next is that 24 megapixels to me actually is more than enough. I don't have much complaints on that. And I don't crop. If I really want to crop, I'll take out my GFX. And then, I'm a MacBook Pro user, so having a SD card slot, I didn't talk about it in the build, but having an SD card slot and a CF Express is something I prefer, because if I really want to shoot something critical, I'll back up to both cards. But if not, the SD card slot can actually easily, load this SD card into my MacBook, and I can quickly read the photos without any need of an external card reader. I do prefer that over, having to always bring a card reader around. And the files are also very small. The R3's files are actually well compressed. They are less than 1 megabyte per megapixel. So, most of the files are about 20 megabytes per shot, which I find very manageable and very usable for the R3. That's why when it comes to actually real-world field usage, I do really like the R3 a lot. And not only that, it has a vertical grip, which I use a lot for portraiture, and the body is actually lighter than the Z9 significantly. Now, of course, depending on what lens you use, the weight will vary a lot, but saving 300 grams outright is really a huge saving. And if you're using lighter lenses or third-party lenses, such as the older EF lens, you do save quite a bit of weight. And also, the R3 is not finicky with old lenses, so I can easily find really cheap, affordable lenses to use from other systems such as Tamron and Sigmas, and I do get very good performance on the R3. And yes, I don't really like the screen as much as those in the Z9, but I definitely prefer this over the A1 screens. If you ask me overall wise, I can live with it. Just I don't like it as much. Now, if you compare this to the A1, I really like the A1 because of its weight and overall features. It is a very fast performing camera. And also the lenses wise, I did notice that Sony has perfected the linear motor, and their lenses do tend to autofocus really, really quickly. In fact, if I'm not shooting at close distance, where the Sony don't have a tendency to focus on lashes and specks, or even if it does, you really can't tell. In those cases, I do like the Sony AF a little bit more. It is really just that a bit quicker. When you get a person to spin, the Sony AF probably can pick it maybe, instead of 2 frames on the R3, maybe 1 frame. Not all the time, but the Sony AF just feels a little bit quicker because of the lenses. Now, that being said, if I'm using the 2870 f2 here, it feels almost as fast. But if you're using something like the 85 1.2 or 50 1.2, the Sony system, the Sony 50 1.2 here is extremely quick. That's really my biggest, I would say, difference between the system itself. And dynamic range wise, I can tell you that all 3 systems are the same. So pretty much, I don't have much complaint about image quality across all 3 systems. Really, if you are complaining about image quality, you are probably pushing it very extremely. And in those cases, maybe a GFX is a better option for you. Now, if you are looking at pricing today, I would say as the R3 is probably not bang for buck, because it is, in Singapore, it's about 8,050 Sing dollars. I purchased it about $100+ more, $200 more, because I purchased it on launch. While the Z9 is actually, the Z9 in Singapore is actually more expensive. So it's not as bang for buck compared, to the R3 in the US. In the R3 is actually slightly cheaper, about $300 cheaper. The A1 is actually really well priced in Singapore, 8,700 Sing dollars. You probably can get it there. And if you're looking at 8.7K, it's just a little bit more, but you do get a very fast and compact system. This is really light. I can hold this with one hand. Holding this with one hand will strain my hand over time. So I will say, as the R3, if you're looking at high-end cameras, the R3 is definitely not bang for buck. And if you are a portrait photographer, I may actually recommend you to buy the R5 instead. But if you are looking for a high-end camera experience with high-end ergonomics and of course the weather sealing and stuff, then definitely the R3 will be the camera for you. And if you can live with 24 megapixels, I do think that the R3 do perform slightly better than the R5. That said, most of us do not have the convenience or the financial capability to choose whatever system we want whenever a new camera is out. So if you are asking me from a Canon user point of view, should you buy the R3? Then I'll ask you one simple question. What do you need on the R3 that's not available on the R5? Is it the 30 frames per second? Is it the ergonomics? Is it the weather sealing? Or do you find the R5 autofocus and IBIS still not up to what you expect? Now, the R3 improves on almost everything on the R5 slightly, except megapixels, which is actually lower, and dynamic range, which is also slightly lower in the higher ISO range. But other than that, you know, the R5 is a lighter platform that performs like 90% of whatever the R3 does, so that a few more extra features on the R3 may not be actually that worth for you. Unless you are really trying to push your camera to the extreme, then I would say as the R3 will be the worth it choice. But if you ask me, you know, as a portrait photographer in the end of the day, is it worth to buy the R3 given that you have unlimited budget? Then yes, that is true. It's still really worth to buy the R3 if you have unlimited budget. Is it worth to buy the R3 for other form of photography? I'll say yes, as long as you can live with 24 megapixels. The R3 at least has a mechanical shutter so that you can, you know, reduce certain problems in certain conditions. Overall, I would say as the R3 is a very nice camera. But my honest opinion is it's very hard to recommend people this because the R5 exists and it performs really, really well at a much lower price. But if you are looking at high-end cameras, then the only bad point about the R3 is the 24 megapixels. If you can live with the 24 megapixel resolution, I do prefer the performance on the R3 the best for the purpose of portrait photography. For any other form of photography, I'm not an expert in it, so it depends on your needs. And if you are looking to adapt lens, I would say the R3 is also fantastic. You can easily buy a lot of EF lenses, which will save you a lot of money, and you can buy more lenses, and the R3 will work perfectly well. And really that's about it for the R3 review. This is all my own personal thoughts. I have used other flagships, I have used other high-end cameras, A7, R4, R5 and whatever. I just think that the R3 is positioned in a very unique way that unless you really need it, you shouldn't buy it. That's what I will say. But if you have all the money to spend in the world, I'll say as the R3 is a top performer in everything but megapixels. And that's why for today, I hope you enjoy my review of the R3. And if it helps you in any way, just write in the comments below. I'll be really happy to respond to you. And if you really like my channel and my review, do like and subscribe too. That being said, if you want to know more about my thoughts of this versus other cameras, you can also write in the comments. I will respond to you how I feel about it. But more often than not, you must tell me what is your purpose and what do you want to achieve and if megapixel matters to you. Because if megapixel matters to you, then you shouldn't even ask the question because the R3 will definitely be out of the answer itself. That's why for today. I hope you enjoyed this and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.